Riverside Riddles, Unraveling the Park's Mysterious Secrets. By Elton Gar. From time to time, I visit a small park just outside of town. It's a fairly average park with a baseball field, a small river, picnic benches, and a few miles of paths that meander through the woods. It is those paths that brought me to the park. I like to bring a small lunch and a book and wander from bench to bench. It's a way for someone who spends too much time on a computer to get outside and exercise without being too bored. Not that the park doesn't bore me. I have nothing against trees, but I've seen them before. What I want is the magic feeling of seeing something new and exciting. That's why I bring a book. The book has even, on rare occasions, been enhanced by the experience, though usually it's the flies and mosquitoes that get the most out of my walks. I try to enjoy the outdoors. That's why, while watching the river, I noticed something odd. Just not odd enough that I thought of it as anything more than a story I told myself to keep my mind busy, except that as it wormed its way into my awareness, the logical explanations disappeared. And as each of those fell away, I became more obsessed with understanding. Let me explain. Just off one path, there are a few stone blocks that have been shaped, so you can use them as hard, uncomfortable benches. They overlook a small, quiet section of the river. Across the river is a 100-foot cliff with woods at the top, not that different from the woods in the park. There is also a path along the edge, because from time to time, I see people walking along the path at the top of the cliff. Nothing strange about that. They're perfectly normal people, walking down a perfectly normal path. What is odd is that there are no bridges across the river and no signs of a park on the other side. So even after looking at maps of the trails, I could never find that path. At first, I simply assumed it was a longer path that crossed the river somewhere else. The path splits a few times, and I'm not in great shape, so I usually followed the paths I know lead to nice, comfortable benches where I can get back to my book. One that went uphill enough to be at the top of a 100-foot cliff simply held little interest for me. But I love a good mystery, and I needed the exercise, so I used that path to motivate myself to explore the paths more fully. As I mentioned, there's a river between the two paths and the cliff. This made it fairly easy to eliminate paths. If it didn't cross the river, it didn't lead to that section of the path. And while it wasn't a massive river, you wouldn't cross it without noticing. Once I explored every path, I considered other possibilities. The most obvious being that there was another way into the park on the other side of the river. That was easier for me to explore because I could use my car rather than having to walk. But while the highway crossed the river, there was no hint of another park. This had moved beyond an amusing story I told myself to make my trips to the park more interesting, and became a real mystery. The one that was still most useful to push myself to walk further. Over the next months, visiting that spot and watching the people across the river became a ritual. I would sit on uncomfortable stone benches for hours reading, and from time to time I would glance up at the people walking by. Mostly they were just people. A few too many for a small, out-of-the-way park, but just people. But from time to time, I would see something odd. For example, one day I saw a small group walking along the path in shorts. As mentioned, I have some extra padding that keeps me warm, and I've stood outside in the winter without a coat because I prefer being chilly to having to wear a coat, but I was wearing my coat that day and was still cold. Wearing shorts, they should have been freezing. That, along with a few other tiny oddities like jerseys for teams I didn't recognize, and a very odd hat, was enough to convince me to do something more dramatic. If I couldn't find a way to that section of the path, I'd go the more direct route. I'd wait until it was warm enough and cross the river, then climb the cliff. So I began to prepare myself. I lost 40 pounds and spent most days at the gym, focusing as often as I could on the climbing wall. The water was still cold when waded through it, but I wasn't willing to wait any longer. Once I was on the other side of the river, I took out my rope and climbed. Glancing back from time to time to see if anyone was watching me, since I wasn't sure if driving the spikes into the cliff was strictly speaking legal. I was going either way, so I hadn't checked. I collapsed onto the grass as I reached the top of the cliff. Next to me was a path every bit as boring as the one on the other side of the river. But there was something strange. When I turned back, the cliff I had just climbed was gone, replaced with a patch of unremarkable woods. That was enough to get me past my exhaustion. I got to my feet and shambled down the path towards where my car would be. If I found any place familiar, I'd just swim back across the river to my car. I passed a couple of people who seemed normal enough, and I convinced myself that I had simply missed something obvious. Except nothing obvious that would explain the cliff disappearing. And as I walked down the path, it became increasingly clear that I had stumbled into something strange. It took about 10 minutes of walking to get to the parking lot. But it wasn't the parking lot where my car had been. It was twice the size, with more cars and several picnic benches, one that was filled with teenagers who were making enough noise that I heard them before I saw them. The cars convinced me that this wasn't my world. The first of those cars was called a Ford. Someone, it seemed, had named their car manufacturer after a candy bar. Of course, for most of you, Ford is a totally normal name. For you, I'm just someone telling a story. But if there is anyone else out there who remembers a place where you could buy a Ford bar, or have seen one of the odd gaps between realities, please let me know. Because as much as I enjoy the excitement of exploring a new world in a book, it's quite different in reality, and I'd like to go home.
Author's note. This is inspired in some small part by a true story. There really is a park near my town, and the stone benches and the cliff exist. On top of that, I still don't know how people get to the path on the other side of the river. But that's mostly because I never tried to find out. Unlike the person in this story, I'm content not knowing. If you enjoyed this story, you can sign up for my newsletter and get a free novel as well as a free short story every week. Or if you sign up for my Patreon, you can get access to all of my short stories, including a weekly Patreon exclusive story at any level. Thanks. Elton Gar.